Thank you and good morning. I want to tell you in a few words how this came about. 2 years ago, Yaron asked me to do with my current book what I did with OPAR, my book on objectivism, namely deliver the completed typescript. You would read it at home, and then we would discuss it. It would be easy for you and easy for me. Unfortunately, like the ominous parallels, the book just grew and grew and grew. And the result is that I haven't written all of the book yet. I've finished 2.5 out of the 3 parts in the form of a relatively early draft, which in my opinion would require approximately 6 more editings once I've come to the end to reach the stage of publication. So I'm estimating now completion of the book in 2009, and then it takes a year after that to get it published, 2010. So in this particular course, you and I both have to do much more work than is appropriate or should ever be required of a human mind. I have to condense, and I have condensed units of 70 pages into 20, cutting out of 50 pages. I have to make that graspable in oral form when it's written very tersely in written form, and by the same token, you have to try to take in what I'm condensing in that form. I'll do the best I can to make it, palatable to you, but it would have been much better if we could have followed the original plan. Now, I want to stress that the book has 3 parts, and this course is only parts 1 and 2. And if you look at the first page of the handout, you'll see the full table of contents. In effect, parts 1 and 2 are the theoretical basis of the book, and part 3 is the actual practical purpose, implications for the future, in other words, the cash value of the theory. Now, the purpose of the book is not to say, oh, you can take education and divide it into 5 fields, or you can take, because who cares? The purpose of the book is to understand where the United States is, culturally and politically, and to predict, therefore, where it is going to be. And the only way I could do that is I have to decide what is the essential factor moving this country or any Western country, and that led me to the dim trends because of the importance I ascribe to integration for reasons you'll see as a moment. So going backwards, that led from part 3 to part 2. And then that led me to, well, what are these trends? Where do they come from? What are they based in? Did I pluck them out of the air? And that is part 1. So really the structure of the book is, what is dim, and am I justified in using that as a lens through which to view culture and history? Then part 2, let's apply it to the main representatives of culture since the Renaissance to see if it's really there, which is so far doesn't tell us anything except it's there. And then it doesn't tell us where we're going. And then in part 3, I start with Greece and go all the way through to the 20th century, showing how I would classify each of the civilizations, Greece, Rome, medieval, etc., in terms of the criteria that I've already established, which tell you the essence of the society. And I work out what I think are the methods, the rules by which, the laws by which one type of a society gives way to another. And then, of course, against that background, I'm quite equipped when I get to the United States today to analyze the trends, say where we are, and say that in the light of history, to say nothing of logic, but I don't want to be a rationalist, this has to be where we're going. And I'm pretty sure of my answer. Chapter 1 is on integration. The fall of Western civilization, if it does fall, was forecast by its beginning. I do not mean that its beginning led to its end. I mean the opposite. Our rejection of our beginning is what is killing us. Our beginning is epitomized by the West's earliest distinctive principle, inherent in the work of Thales, the father of Western philosophy. And the most famous of his 4 remaining sentences is, all things are water. Now, earlier cultures, like children, perceived a vast array of material objects: rivers, people, pots, corn stalks, stars, and they grasped the differences within this array. But they did not think much about these similarities. It never occurred to them to ask whether there was a physical connection, a common stuff or structure or pattern of action between pots and stars. They never dreamt of asking whether there might be such a connection uniting everything. Hence, the door to science and to philosophy remained closed. Thales is the first man in recorded history to face the bewildering diversity of perceptual objects and ask, what do they all have in common? What is the underlying similarity that unites into an intelligible whole this riot of differences? Then in the next century, Socrates carried the same question to the field of language, the tool of thought. In regard to words central to philosophy, such as knowledge, virtue, justice, beauty, his procedure was to seek clarity by asking, what is the common denominator uniting the various instances? What is the essence that makes all just acts, despite their many differences, instances of the same one concept? Now, the Greeks soon came to phrase this kind of inquiry in general and immortal terms. What they asked is the one in the many. And you could capitalize always, a one in the many, just the O and the M. And this question they pursued in many areas unknown to Thales or Socrates. Earlier civilizations were content to observe the objects around them and then cognitively to stop. The Greeks also observed, but then as a matter of policy, they went on to abstract, to distinguish essentials, to generalize. And that policy enabled them to theorize about every aspect of the universe, including its fundamental elements, its universal laws, and even eventually the processes by which we come to gain all this knowledge. The pre-Greeks you can look at as the childhood of the human race. The Greeks, for the first time in history, were man grown up. They were man moving confidently on the adult, rational level. Now, the fact that Thales' answer was water, then that answer is primitive, is irrelevant. His unsurpassed achievement is that he was the first explicitly to suggest to mankind a new process of cognition. And today, I'm going to use throughout the lectures and the book this word in its philosophic and not in its racial sense. I'm going to call the Socrates process of putting the many together into a one integration. And I don't mean changing the way you sit on a bus. The discovery of this process, along with its philosophic preconditions and implications, was the origin of Western culture. Where then should we look to explain the desperate state of the culture today? Given our beginning, is it possible that the way we think could be the key to our disaster? Is it possible that the story of Western culture is the rise and fall not so much of the conclusions men come to, but of the method of thought which was once at the root of their thought. Now here I'll repeat what I said more slowly at the opening. The goal of the dim hypothesis is to reach a prognosis in regard to the West, the most precious invalid in history, whose condition keeps deteriorating through the decades. What is its disease? Is there a cure? Can it survive? How long does it have? These are the questions every Westerner needs to ask, and a great many are, and I think these questions can be answered objectively. Such an inquiry, by its nature, is complex. The society of the future flows directly from the influential trends moving the present in art, science, education, politics, and more. And therefore, these trends have to be identified. And these, in turn, have grown from their roots in the past. Today's culture has developed through a progression of Western societies, not just one, but a progression, going back to the Greeks, the Romans, the medieval, the Renaissance, the 17th, the Enlightenment, and then the deluge. And it is this history that has led to our own culture, its trends, and its plight. Only when we understand the rise and fall of these societies can we extrapolate the implication for the future. In other words, we have to know the logic of the historical progression. And the only way I know to know that is in dim terms. This society was I, and for these reasons it gave rise to M1, etc. And here's a whole pattern through thousands of years, leading to wherever. Now, according to objectivism, I don't mean to deny, the fundamental cause of this progression is in philosophy, and especially in its basic branches. In any era, as you know, philosophy is what shapes man's thought, values, and action. I don't deny that. I wrote a whole book on that. But the specific subject of this book is not the power of the basic principles of philosophy. It is not that power. It's the power of a crucial corollary of these principles, namely men's view of integration, the way they practice or don't practice integration. And I say that that acts as an intermediary between general philosophy and daily life. In other words, I seek to identify the implications of general philosophy for the Greek method of thought, the method of going from the many to the one. And then in terms of this one issue, to exhibit philosophy's impact on Western man's culture and current state. If man's view of integration, as my hypothesis maintains, is a powerful and hitherto unidentified force in human affairs, then my approach should add something important to our understanding of them, something uniquely clarifying, diagnostic, and predictive. Now, you'll have to decide whether this claim is justified as we proceed so far as you can on the basis of 2/3 of the book. Now, since the whole book rests on the concept of integration, we must understand this concept thoroughly, not merely in the form of the pregnant suggestions of the ancients, but in its full philosophical definition and in its broad range of application. Such an understanding, however, must grow out of observational material. We must first study integration at work in its primary setting, within consciousness, i.e. in the pursuit of knowledge. Now to integration. When I first met her at 17, my first impression of Ayn Rand was of a figure standing on a mountaintop, seeing connections I had never imagined everywhere she looked. The world down in the valley, the people down in the valley, found it easy to differentiate concretes. Everyone knew that communism is not conservatism, that Rachmaninoff was not John D. Rockefeller, and that economics has nothing to do with sex. But Ayn Rand put things together. In one evening, she could discuss each of these pairs, and as she explained to me by what fundamental similarities their members are connected. During that evening, I fell in love with integration, and that has been a lifelong affair. Now, in psychological terms, the vital importance of integration seems to be almost universally understood and even built into our language. What a shattering experience, you say to a friend. Please don't fall apart. No, the friend assures us, I won't go to pieces. I'm going to pull myself together. In that, popularized way, you see the understanding there's something bad about falling apart. There's something important about keeping it together. That's integration and disintegration. Now, a year or so after I met her, I learned from Ayn Rand that integration is the key to understanding not only the Greeks or modern politics, but human cognition as such in any field, era, or stage of complexity. And this follows from the very nature of human knowledge as interpreted by Objectivism. Now here, there's a whole section on Objectivism for people who don't know it. The metaphysics is reality, this world, no supernatural dimension, governed by the law of identity, the law of cause and effect. Epistemology, reason is the only faculty of knowledge, reason consisting of three elements: perception, conception, and logic. And each of these three elements, I assume you know, is a form of integration. The perception of an entity is a result of our brain's automatic integration of an infant's scattered sensations. Logical thinking is an integration of data, namely the premises, in accordance with Aristotle's laws of logic. I think it's obvious where integration comes into these two elements. But the most important place that it comes in is in the third element, in concepts, the fundamental tool of man's consciousness. Now here you can read the Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, but for our purposes, the essence of concepts is integration. A concept, according to Ayn Rand, is an integration of percepts with their measurements omitted. And its purpose is unit economy, to enable us to hold an unlimited number of units in one mental frame. Or if we put it in Thales terms, to hold many units in existence in one frame of consciousness. So it is a form, abstraction and integration that forms a concept, is a form of uniting the many into the one. And I'm going to keep using that because that was the initial language and that captures it in every form that it comes up. Now, Ayn Rand's theory explains the fundamental role of concepts and therefore of integration in human life, because a concept is a type of integration. They're not two different things. She explains how and why integration has such power. And this power is not merely a mental tool in man's pursuit of knowledge. It is the tool. And this is what I want you to see, because otherwise my whole thesis is down the drain. If integration is nice, but there's also four other nice things, then why pick it out and make a book out of it? I say that you can describe human consciousness with the exact same meaning as a conceptual faculty or as an integrating faculty. Now, of course, if concepts are to perform their vital function, they must be integrations, as against, on the one hand, floating abstractions, and as against, on the other hand, perceptual level, concrete-bound mentalities who don't integrate. Now, it's interesting to note that you cannot, at the same moment, literally hold a concept and a whole constellation of its instances in the focus of your consciousness at the same instant. The one demands an attention to similarity and casting aside differences, and the other a focus on objects which are awash with differences and you have to set aside the similarity to grasp them all as concrete. Now, the only way to keep both aspects real during a thought process is the practice of what I call alternate focus. In other words, of changing the direction of one's intention, moving back and forth rapidly between concepts, that is to say, concepts you haven't already automatized, concepts and instances. I think the best name for this policy is shuttling. Shuttling identifies the manner in which you can think while perceiving and perceive while thinking. And the two processes performed together like this are what keep a human consciousness tied to reality. A floating abstraction, now try to get used to this terminology. A floating, because it has a purpose. A floating abstraction is a castle in the air, a one with no many. A mere spread of percepts is a many without a one. The first misses reality. It's just floating. The second misses understanding. It's just staring. Only the mind able to shuttle at will can understand reality. And that's what Ayn Rand calls the conceptual level mind. That's the one that grasps not the one without the many, and not the many without the one, but the one in the many. So you see already, there sounds suspiciously like there's going to be three possibilities of something. Now, when Ayn Rand stresses integration, she does not mean to put down the role of other cognitive processes. She does not believe that putting together exhausts cognition. There could be no integration into a concept if we couldn't perform a number of other processes, including perception and differentiation and abstraction, etc. Her point, however, is that the primary and the distinctively human role of these others is the product they help to create. In other words, the word, a concept, with its limitless compressed content and all the cognitive doors this opens. And the word is a unit, an integration. Integration, therefore, is not merely one among several cognitive processes, because an integrated state of consciousness is specifically what all the others cooperate to achieve and then help to clarify and apply. Now, since integration is the essence of a concept, every form of the development of human consciousness and every form of cognition we apply is a form of integration. That's the only thing we can do is integrate. How we do it is a different question. Now, here's some highlights of the progression from child to, all-encompassing genius of the role of integration, just touching on it. Once you form the concepts necessary to identify certain observations, what comes then is the process of reaching generalizations on the basis of observation. And generalizing is a form of integrating. Through measurement omission, the process blends many observed facts of a certain kind into a new mental one. All S is P. Now, the instances of a generalization, as of a concept, are limitless. And most of them are outside the possibility of human perception. But by condensing them into a one, into a single unit within consciousness, we are enabled to grasp, retain, and deal cognitively with such an otherwise unimaginable mass of data. Now, the obvious example is the unlimited number of cases extending across all time and all space, which are held in mind by understanding simply 4 words. All men are mortal, which are held in our mind as a one. Those 4 words are many which become one sentence, which you hold as a single unit. So the whole process is a process of integration. Now, the validation of inductive inference is complex, certainly outside my province here. I've made some suggestions in regard to it in an earlier course, and I just want to point out in passing that no generalization follows from any series of its instances, because since they're unlimited, there's always more that you haven't yet studied. But it does follow from them if the observations have been integrated with the rest of man's knowledge. In the case of science, you integrate by experimentation and mathematics. There again, the validation, induction is a form of integration, and its validation is a form of integration. Now let's go up the cognitive ladder to principles. A principle is a fundamental generalization. In other words, one which unites and thereby helps to explain a wide range of generalizations, all of which had previously been regarded as a disconnected many. So when Newton reached his laws of motion and gravitation, he was able to make a mental whole out of numerous, very different discoveries, including most of those made by Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. Now, in relation to Newton, those earlier discoveries, although they were still integrations of instances, were now seen as instances themselves of a much broader integration. So the passage is still from narrower to higher integrations. Now, don't let me forget deduction here, because that is also a form of integration. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. In this case, you are applying a generalization by putting it together with information about one of the concretes that comes under it. Then, in order to avoid contradiction, you infer additional information. In deduction, the premises, however numerous they may be, become a unit within consciousness, one unit, which we call the proof. You give one name and it becomes one entity. All those many premises we put together as one entity, the proof. And then we integrate the argument as a whole, as one entity with the law of contradiction to see whether it's valid or not. Now, let's keep going, because you can find integration everywhere within cognition, and you cannot find cognition without it. That is, I want you to understand that he did not pick integration out of the air and say, gee, that interests me, let's write a book about it. Now we go to the higher reaches of knowledge, and let's suppose we've already integrated our observations, principles, theories, and so on into a number of specialized sciences. And crucial next step is the integration of sciences, a process which has been indispensable both to the rise and to the development of modern science. Astronomy, for example, was regarded for centuries as unrelated and even opposed to physics, since it dealt with the celestial and physics with the sublunary, the things below the moon. Then it was discovered that Copernicus, his heliocentric view, depended for its proof in part on Galileo's earthly experiments. So we came to learn that each of these sciences is indispensable to the other. Or again, to the ancients, mathematics and physics were unrelated, essentially. And now, thanks to Galileo and Newton, we speak of nothing but mathematical physics. Or again, until Maxwell, electricity was one thing and studied separately from magnetism. Now you wouldn't think of studying anything but electromagnetism. And notice that the development of science went step by step until Einstein was looking for a unified theory, which would integrate everything into one, whatever, principle, set of principles, mystic experience, whatever. But time and again, the advance of knowledge has been one in which integrations on ever higher levels are themselves integrated. Now, the fact that integration of sciences is possible within limits and necessary is only a special case of a much broader principle. I guess I could omit this and you would follow, but this is really the fundamental reason why integration is everywhere. Integration applies at any stage of cognition to the sum total of knowledge at that stage. And you could not have knowledge at any stage if this were not true. And this is true no matter to what fields or what issues the knowledge pertains. All the differences, the blatant differences between different subject matters, different questions, different issues you are concerned with, that's the many of your knowledge. But here too, the conceptual level mind seeks to relate, grasp hidden similarities, discover connections, unify. Now, what does the unity of knowledge mean? It means the unity of a man's conceptual structure. I would write that down, if anything, in this lecture. Plus, you should write the one in the many. The unity of knowledge means the unity of a man's conceptual structure. Ayn Rand has compared a concept, as you know, to a folder that holds everything so far known about its reference. If the folders are properly labeled and organized, the material in any one folder is accessible as needed to all inquirers, no matter with what other folders, with what other questions or subjects they're primarily concerned. So in this kind of structure, no folder is shut off from the others. On the contrary, all are treated as interrelated parts of a whole, one whole. The many are all part of the one whole, which of course we had to achieve. It didn't just come by itself. In any inquiry, a fact from any field is potentially relevant. Now, this does not mean that every fact is relevant to every inquiry. because then you could never think. It would make all investigation impossible because you'd have to take everything in the universe into account on any point. But what it does mean is that any fact you learn tomorrow in any field, once you learn it, may shed important light on today's specific inquiry. Hence, while pursuing the inquiry, you must be ready to seize on any such fact once it has been discovered. Even if you're only interested in one narrow object or area, you must be receptive to the emergence of significant knowledge from any quarter. In other words, you must be ready to integrate in any direction that the evidence warrants. Now, in the above sense, our knowledge has to be a structure of cognitions, a system, a single system, a unity. The only alternative would be a so-called self-contained item of knowledge, detached from all the others. And such an item would be invalidated by that very fact. It can't be knowledge because it's non-rational. It's closed to some or all of the potentially relevant evidence. Now, a long tradition of philosophers has championed the unity of knowledge. The objectivist view of this unity, however, is distinctive. The principle of achieving cognitive unity does not require years of studying mathematics, as Plato said, or arranging ideas into triads, as Hegel said, or starving in the desert, as an army of Christians said. Nor does the unity of knowledge mean that you have to grasp, either now or in eternity, connections between every item or area of cognition. It is not necessarily true that every item or area of cognition is connected to every other. What this principle tells us is that you must look for such connections, or else renounce the title of knower. Now, the unity of knowledge is in no way incompatible with cognitive specialization. What the principle condemns are specialists who claim an epistemological right to be ignorant of all fields but their own, on the grounds that their discipline exists in a cognitive vacuum which is self-validating. And of course, Ayn Rand dismisses such people as compartmentalizers. All right, now let's go on from integration as it actually occurs within your consciousness as a means of acquiring knowledge. Since integration is the essential process of human consciousness, it's going to have to pervade human life in every field in some form. Its forms, its derivatives are going to have to be everywhere. And the range of the products of integration, I'll just give you a few examples. The plot of a novel is an integrated progression of events. Many events, one story. A man's moral character is the integrated sum of his individual values and actions, good and or evil. A school curriculum, subjects taught in a certain order to add up to a certain result. A nation made of its individual citizens. A legal system made of connected statutes. A philosophic system made of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. So there are a tremendous number of diverse forms of integration, as there would have to be if integration is the key mental process, and we live by translating our thought into reality. You're going to have to find integration all over. So we should really know exactly what it is. Now, I have a lot of technical definitions here. Don't copy them down. If you really have to, ask me in the question period, and I'll dictate them. Most of them are stolen directly from the Oxford English Dictionary, so you can get them from there and copy it much more easily. I'm just taking the simplest excerpt to give the idea. But I want to make clear some of these terms, because we can't use them, they're so broad, we can't use them so undefined and so empty that everything is integration, everything is a whole. So let's start with integration. Comes from integer, which comes from the Latin for untouched or intact, and thus means whole. I'm not going to keep saying W. That's W-H-O-L-E. Now here's the OED's definition of integration. The making up of a whole by combining separate parts. I picked out a few words from a mass paragraph. The making up of a whole by combining separate parts. Now, clearly, the central concept here is whole. What is a whole? I mean, I'll be subsumed just from the few examples I gave you, a tremendous number of types of things. Well, they define whole essentially in terms of the concept of connection. A connection. And this is their definition, as excerpted by me. A whole is something made of parts in mutual connection. Something made of parts in mutual connection. By the way, they also give a definition of whole, which is like the best one, but it takes so long to explain. A complex unity or system. Because that brings in unity and system, which are other, but you have to do them all first, so leave aside unity for the moment. And let's just, for instance, look at system. I said that connection is essential to a whole. Now, they say a whole is a complex system. So let's just, for the moment, look at system. And it tells us that system denotes an organized or connected group of objects. So what keeps popping up is that integration is creating a whole, and a whole, the parts are connected. So what is a connection? Let me just say quickly in parentheses that their definitions subsume wholes that were not created by man, such as an organism or a constellation, etc. My book pertains only to man's method of thought and its effects. So I limit all these terms within that framework. Now let us look at what is meant by connection. Well, we approach it by saying, because that's a key one, if the parts of a whole are connected, they don't merely exist together in space and time. They may even be widely separated in space and time. For instance, the instances of a concept are connected. And we can make a one out of that many, but they're all over the universe forever. So space and time is not connection. Well, people say, well, the parts are joined together. They're bound together. But that is a metaphor. It's an analogy. What does it really mean? Well, let's see what is the source in reality for what could be a connected combination. According to Objectivism, the basic law of reality is the law of identity. And hopefully you know that a fact is necessary if and only if it is logically necessary. In other words, it is an instance, direct or indirect, of the law of identity. So any alternative to it then would be contradictory and therefore impossible. Now, in regard to metaphysics, law of identity covers the entire field of causal relationships. and here again I'm assuming your knowledge, an entity must, in any given set of circumstances, must act as it does, because any other action would contradict the nature of the entity. So the parts of a causal sequence are logically connected. In other words, they are combined necessarily, and therefore they form a whole. Now, when Newton, for example, integrated an immense series of facts, he did it by tracing them back step by step to an entity of a certain kind, one having mass, which therefore acts in certain definite ways. His physics is thus a system, a whole, not a congeries of ad hoc hypotheses, because its elements, being a series of causes and effects, are connected. Now, Newton had a purpose in pursuing physics. He was seeking knowledge, but the system he discovered is independent of his or anyone's purpose. It is a whole simply by virtue of the causal relationships it identifies, and only the facts determine whether it stands or falls. But another form of whole exists when a man pursues means in order to achieve ends, whenever he enacts a cause in order to achieve an effect. In this case, the whole is still a connected series of elements, of actions. And the series is necessitated not by the laws of motion, but by his desired goal along with his knowledge of the appropriate means. Since man has free will, the actions of a purposeful man are not necessary in the manner of the events studied by Newton, but they do constitute a necessary combination given the actor's choice of a goal. Now let me mention wholes, whose parts, though still connected by the fact of identity, are not connected by cause and effect. In a mathematical system, for example, such as geometry, the theorems follow from the axioms necessarily, in accordance with the law of contradiction. The result is a whole whose parts, the axioms and the theorems, are again logically connected, but not through causality. In this case, we're not describing entities taking actions. The subject matter deals only with the relationships among quantitative abstractions. Now, let's try to summarize the source of necessity, of necessary connection, according to Objectivism. The law of identity gives rise to necessity in two related ways. Metaphysically, in regard to the actions of entities, it does so through its corollary to the law of causality. Epistemologically, in regard to the pursuit of any knowledge, whether of causality or anything else, it does so through its corollary, the law of contradiction. The first, causality, tells us that reality consists of lawful sequences and therefore can be understood. The second, that logical thought is our method of understanding it. So all necessary connection goes back ultimately to the law of identity, either through the law of contradiction and or through the law of cause and effect, which are reformulations or corollaries of man. According to of the law of identity. According to Objectivism, therefore, if integration is to be possible to man, then two factors, causality and logic, are its precondition. If either is absent, men can create no wholes. A non-causal reality like Hume's would be a stream of disconnected data paralyzing the mind, and that kind of chaos would make concept formation and all of its integrative applications, including mathematics, impossible. A non-logical pursuit of knowledge, to take the other side, would mean a stream of disconnected and even self-contradictory inner states. And that kind of mental chaos would also be the death of any thought process. Now, I've been giving you the objectivist interpretation of the preconditions of necessity. There are other philosophies with different, very different interpretations of what necessity consists of, and in due course, we will get to them. So, to sum up this point, connection denotes a necessary relationship among elements. A necessary relationship among elements. And such a relationship flows ultimately from the law of identity through its two corollaries. Got that? So we can now say about a whole that it's a certain kind of combination of elements. It's a combination of connected elements. A whole is a combination of connected elements. So where integration has to achieve a whole, it has to not only put together, but connect, necessarily connect various elements by one of its means, one or more of its means of connection. Now, if you can take one more, since we keep saying the one, and all these concepts are so closely related, connection, whole, integration, but I got to get to one. The OED has a very long definition of this one, but I'll give you just a taste of it. The number of a single thing without any more. The addition of another to which makes two. And then they have a briefer one later. A single thing, or the abstract number denoting a single thing. And that I like the best. Now, it all comes down to a thing in contrast to things. And that's given you, in any perception, when you focus on one entity, you see as against the other entities. So you get the one and the many directly from perception. I would say the concept of one is ultimately derived from man's percepts of any one thing, but his percepts from a quantitative perspective. His percepts from the amount in relation to other entities and to its own parts, which are also a many. So it's a twofold quantitative perception. The parts of a whole are as many, but the parts are connected. So the many become one. That's really as simple as I can boil it down to. Now, just to confuse you, as a general rule of lecturing, when a point is finally clear, say one further elaboration to wipe it all out. Not every one is a many. For example, if you take the irreducible particles or pulses, whatever you want to call them, quanta, whatever that comprise matter, by definition they're irreducible, so they have no parts. They are simple ones. One as against the others, but simple because they're not a union of parts. A whole, by contrast, they wouldn't be called wholes. They're one, but they're not a whole. A whole is a complex one. It's a unity made of parts which are necessarily connected. You got that? Does anybody have that? Yeah, well, that's good. Now, the opposite of all these concepts denoting whole is juxtaposition. Juxtaposition. In other words, the mere proximity of objects in space and or time. A bombed building, for example, is not a whole. There is no longer a purposeful connection uniting the piles of shattered girders and glass. At most, there is a juxtaposition of lesser wholes. The same principle applies to consciousness. If a politician, I'm sure you can guess who, if a politician advocates lower taxes, random wars, less UN, more allies, more Medicare, less welfare, more freedom, and a law against biological research, this is not an intellectual whole, though it may be part of a strategical system. But such random contradictions are the rejection of logical necessity and add up to no viewpoint. They are merely a juxtaposition of sentences, the mental equivalent of a bombed building. Now, if you want an artistic example of the same thing, look at any painting by Jackson Pollock. Now, in my view, the only whole in this case is the physical canvas. The so-called painting is a perfect example of or better, anti-integration, resulting in a non-whole precisely because it is a mere juxtaposition. In this case, a deliberately disorganized and disconnected assemblage of smears. Mere coexistence within the same frame is mere spatial relationship. In other words, it's by definition nothing but juxtaposition. Now, there are many instances of the Pollock type which are identified and often acclaimed in our world today as integrations, even though they are not wholes at all, but the exact opposite. A man, to change the example, following nothing but his whim of the moment, goes to a movie, he feels bored, makes a pass at a waitress, she arouses him, lies down on a park bench, he feels tired, flies to Buffalo, he suddenly misses his aunt, etc. Now, this cluster of actions is devoid of connection, and connection is one of our technical terms, and thus does not comprise a whole. It adds up, and adds up is another way of saying it can't be integrated. It adds up to nothing. It is not like the integrated actions of a student pursuing a career or of an ascetic pursuing God, who's got a definite progression worked out, or even of a housewife buying groceries, precisely because this man has no integrating purpose. Instead, there's only temporal succession. In other words, again, mere juxtaposition. Now, it's not an answer to say, as some people do, that his actions are united because they were chosen by the same man's whim. Choice is not integration, not if what one chooses is the random and unconnected, nor is the ability to describe the events. I've heard this one described as, quote, Bill's day, unquote, therefore it's conceptualized. That is not a connection except among the words. Not everything with a name is a whole, and not every whole has a name. A connection among elements does not consist in the deliberate absence of connection. All right, now let me sum up in positive terms the results of our analysis so far. There are 4 essential concepts. Each denotes the same phenomenon in reality, but each does so from a different aspect. System identifies the fact that the constituents of an entity are combined in a definite relationship. But it doesn't yet say what, just that they're in a definite relationship, they're not random. Connection identifies the nature of that relationship. It says that the relationship is necessary. Whole identifies the fact that the entity whose constituents we've now connected necessarily is a combination. And one simply identifies the entity quantitatively in relation both to its constituents and its neighbors. So if I give it to you in one triply repetitive statement for emphasis, a unity of systematically connected elements. A unity of systematically connected elements. This is what constitutes a whole, and this is what is created by the process of integration. Now, I hope that makes it specific enough so it doesn't just float. Now, I'm going to try to get a little bit more in before. I know I've run out of time, but that's life. Okay, I want to go to the next topic, which is that integration is not automatic nor automatically correct. If it were, history would be the story of perpetual progress. But man has the power of choice. And a being of volitional consciousness has to choose what cognitive processes it will perform and then learn how to perform them properly. The most general term for a cognitive process performed properly is valid. The application of this term, of course, depends on one's standard of validity. And that, in turn, follows from your view of reality and of knowledge. It's defined by metaphysics and epistemology. I've said that the object of knowledge, that the object of knowledge is reality, and therefore a valid process of integration is one based on reality. And I've said that our means of knowledge is reason, with logic as its method. And so in epistemological terms, therefore, a valid process is one which is rational. And you understand that those two formulations are equivalent. Now, an eloquent example of a valid integrating process is the generalizing of Galileo. He inferred his conclusion about acceleration in free fall from a series of experiments which eliminated competing interpretations of the observed data. His results integrated with those of his experiments in other areas, and his conclusion was eventually brought under Newton's law, as we say, of gravitation. Here was a generalization, an integration, complete with precise definitions of its high-level concepts, based on sense perception and induction therefrom, and guided at each step by the principles of logic. So that's a model of integrative validity. Now, on the other hand, consider the superstition that black cats bring bad luck, which is a generalization plucked by the credulous from a handful of random instances and then upheld without proof. Such people make no attempt to look for counterexamples. They don't define terms, such as bad luck. They don't consult already established knowledge about cats, colors, etc. That's the pattern of any invalid process of integration. Whereas Galileo's mind was fact-oriented, this man proceeds with virtually no reference to facts. He bases his idea not on reason, but on feeling, fear, piety, drugs, whatever. But now it is important to understand that a whole which has been wrongly produced is still a whole. In other words, you better write this one down. An invalid integrating process is still an integrating process. Your thought does not have to be valid to be integrative. Now take the superstition about cats, for example. It's a generalization. It's a product of the distinctively human method of cognition. In other words, of compressing unlimited data into a unit. That is the same mental process that valid integration involves, even though in this case it has been performed wrongly. And everyone recognizes that the new unit here, the generalization, is a unit. Within certain limits, we understand the countless concretes it subsumes and the predictions it implies. Now contrast this type of case with that of concrete-bound people, surrounded, say, by cats, but who are interested only in the particular animal before them at any given moment, and come to no wider conclusions of any kind. Such men perform no conceptual process in regard to their experience and create no mental product. They exemplify neither valid nor invalid integration, but simply non-integration. They don't do it. They don't do it rightly, they don't do it wrongly, they don't do it. And I want you to observe here that the elements of invalidly created wholes, even though the creator is irrational, still fulfill the definition of whole, which I gave you. The black cats in this case are not juxtapositions. They are connected, i.e. necessarily related to one another. Now, I hasten to add that the connection in this case does not flow from reality. This man is not an objectivist. They flow from non-rational assumptions of the integrator. Take, for instance, the generalization about black cats. Objectively, there's no causal connection between cats and luck, nor therefore any necessary relationship uniting all these cats. But approach the situation now not from an objective, but from a pre-scientific viewpoint, made of premises such as a predilection to believe in the mystic power of fate, a fear of the color symbolizing evil, and, not knowing methodology, an implicit notion that B follows A is the same as A causes B. Within this non-rational framework, a cat/luck relation, cat/luck relation can easily be viewed as a causal connection, even by those who entirely reject the irrational framework. The relation is necessary as a matter not of consistency with reality, but of internal consistency within the non-rational framework. Now, I don't mean to imply that every irrational fantasy has an inner logic. Even when they're sane, men are capable of the totally senseless. But my point is that if an asserted connection of elements is regarded as totally senseless, lacking any imaginable framework within which it coheres, one cannot then make out of the elements any new unit, whether rational or irrational. The cause of that is that you cannot discover any perspective from which to grasp a necessary relationship among the elements. For example, suppose I'm told that yellow labs speed up probate proceedings. I can memorize that, but that's it. Since there's no connection I can fathom here, not in any context, I can't dream of what framework would lead to that, I can't accept that conjunction as any kind of integration, any more than I can integrate into a unit, whether rational or otherwise, some oranges, some symphonies in the square root of -1. I can't integrate that, because there's absolutely nothing that I can see as a framework, as a context, or as a common denominator. Now, a much more respectable and imposing view, example of the requirement that the whole have at least an internal consistency would be the scholastic philosophy, which follows logically, step by step, from a set of axioms purely on faith. Now, because of its starting points, the integrating process is detached from reality, so it's invalid. But the result, nevertheless, is an intellectual whole and necessarily connected from the axioms. It's not based on reality, but given the premises, the long train of conclusions necessarily follows. And in that sense, the elements are connected and do combine into a system. Contrast this to just, fortune cookie philosophic asides that are scribbled down at random. That is not no necessary connection. Why don't you ask me in the question period whether valid integration always leads to truth? That's an interesting question. So I'm going to just wrap up here before dinner arrives by saying that the important thing in understanding an intellectual trend in terms of fundamentals is to focus not only on the ideas that are advocated, but the ideas as results of the approach to integration practiced by its leaders. We have to discover the men who move the world and then identify that within them, which is their prime mover. Now, I think it should be clear to you that there are three distinct alternatives in regard to integration. Valid, invalid, so far we've just called it non, but it's going to become anti-integration. And this is the base of the Trinity, for which DIM is an acronym. And I'm going to close with one last, hopefully, rapid example, but I think it's clarifying. 3 students are asked by a teacher to evaluate her lecture course. One of them reviews the lessons, their clarity, the teacher's manner, the assignments, and puts it all together, reaching, say, an enthusiastic endorsement. A second runs through similar counts, but is steaming because of a low grade he regards as unfair. Governed by the steam, he happily slams the course. A third student hears the question and is indignant. He starts to review. Last Tuesday, I remember the first hour was clear, but she didn't get to the last section of the question. Now her assignments, well, they were easy in February, at least part of them were, but then we had difficult homework. I can't remember March. April was sort of easier. She's pretty boring, but actually she's got fascinating elements to her. How can I add all this up? It can't be done. And this is a stupid question. It's unanswerable. Now, this guy is the third type of response. It's not a third answer, but it is a rejection of the question. We're going to find all 3 of those in abundance as we proceed. Thank you very much. That was my shortest lecture. Okay. Just go ahead.
Does valid integration always lead to the truth?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. No. Valid pertains to method. And it's the same thing. Are you rational if you come up after thinking conscientiously with a wrong answer? Certainly. You cannot ask a volitional being to meet a standard which would be possible only to an automatic and infallible entity. So any standard that's put forth on any level, rational, logical, moral, integrative, whatever, leaves open the possibility that you will make an error. The example I was going to use in class was Kepler, who was a great scientist, as Dave Hammer sure is going to tell you in detail. But on the basis of data that he got from Gilbert and Tycho Brahe and other people, he came to the conclusion, which was very logical within his framework, that the force that the sun exerted on the planets was a form of magnetism. And it wasn't that. But he reached that by, integrating what was already known. It fit all the data. So it was a valid integration which led to a mistake. Now, that is not common, but it is certainly possible. The good thing about it is, though, this is why science is self-correcting. Because those type of mistakes, since the methodology is laid out, are easy for anybody else in the field to come, at a later point and say, well, there are other forces other than magnetism, which we can integrate much more broadly because they know his reasoning. So even the mistaken integration is a step forward, although it is a mistake. So I myself would say valid integration, the method, determines the course of a culture and of history. I mean, if it's there. But it does not necessarily do so by always coming up with the truth. It merely establishes the method. And usually errors are caught by anybody who uses that method. If you look at the Founding Fathers, they had a very good method in politics and just reliance on the Bible and ethics. So the few errors they made in politics, unfortunately, were taken over. But if you had a rational world, given what they established, you would have no problem with eminent domain and things like that. Well, on the other hand, if you took what they left in ethics, you can't correct it. You have to start over with every hotel and all the Gideon Bible. Is that answered? Yes.
Dr. Peikoff, I'm wondering, I understand the purpose that you set out.
Is that you, Diana?
Yes, that's
I can't see that. Okay.
I understand the purpose that you set out in your book as explaining where the United States is and where we're going. But I'm wondering if your dim hypothesis, you'd say that it has a secondary purpose, a more personal one, that it can help us direct our own integration in our own life in the right direction, as well as avoid the common errors that we're going to be seeing later.
I don't think I would claim that. I would say only if you happen to be attracted to various fields, to various approaches within a field. Like, for instance, I don't want to be sarcastic, but if you like classical education, say, that is a big mistake. This course will explain, that it's wrong and what you should instead, and you might from that infer broader methods of thinking, but it's not at all a how-to course, and I don't know that it's so complicated just to grasp the historical progression. I don't think you could, it wouldn't be worthwhile to try to abstract that from the book. I've undertaken enough, with a survey of all subjects throughout history. Yes.
Dr. Peikoff, I'm wondering if, when you were writing the ominous parallels, if you would have done anything differently had you formulated the dim hypothesis at that time.
So you don't read my website, I see. I have, just out of curiosity, out of publicity, I have a website and I have a monthly Q&A where I take all the best Q&As and answer them. And that was one of the ones that I answered. So I'll give you the answer. But by the way, I'm changing to I got to get that word right, podcast. It's like a broadcast, but it's not. Because the writing of those answers takes a lot of time, whereas I can always talk off the cuff. Yes, I would not emphasize the same way in the ominous parallels. I would not have believed, I started that book in '68. At the height of the student rebellion, we were all panicked. And religion, ever since I came to this country in the early 50s, was regarded as absolutely laughable. There was a Bible Belt somewhere of benighted, moronic people that had no influence. They were regarded the way you would now regard, some cult like the Amish and people like that. They're just out of the world, and you would never think of them. And that's the way religion was regarded. So we would have thought it's laughable to say 40 million Americans are going to be born again, and that half of them talk to God on a daily basis. I mean, we would have thought that's absolutely ridiculous. So I did point out in the book in what way Hitler depended on religion, specifically on his Catholic upbringing, and in what way, it was a Teutonic religion that they tried to bring in. But I did not bring in the actual attempt in this country to resurrect Christianity. I didn't know that was coming. It wouldn't change a lot. I do believe I could rewrite that book in a month, the last part, and make entirely clear the role of religion and that it doesn't change. It's just more horrifying America than Nazism in that regard, because that a country could get this far and go back to the Dark Ages is more frightening than, both the communists and the Nazis claim they're going to give all the great, wonderful standard of living and industrial power. And now they're throwing it all to go back to the Dark Ages. And, if you think, well, at least the Dark Ages didn't have concentration camps, true, they were much worse today because of technology. But you should read some books on the Spanish Inquisition and the tortures that these people were subjected to. It's absolutely hair-raising. As bad as I knew, the church rule was throughout that period, I just couldn't believe that these things went on. The types of torture. So if they take over, it's not going to be, it's a milder, friendlier love and compassion. But yes, I would have emphasized that more. Yes.
Dr. Peikoff, I'm interested in the application of what you're doing to psychology. You mentioned in the beginning about things like, people who are, I'm falling apart, I've got to get my act together, that kind of thing. What you're doing, an application of this to cultural trends, it also, I assume, does apply to just personal development.
It does, but that's not, you'll see when I get to Jim, that's not subsumed under it. What is, although I don't cover it, is the science of psychology. In other words, there are definitely the 5 approaches to psychology which come under my 5. You only know 3, but I throw in 2 more, which come under my categories. And I gave that on tape. But psychology is not developed enough, and I needed something that goes through the ages. Psychology is a very, very modern thing. But I can't remember now. It's been so long since I looked at psychology. If I remember, Skinner was the archetype of M, and Freud was the archetype of D. And then there were others. But I've never gone into, I don't know anything about, people's motives and all that. I've never studied it. I don't think it would apply.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Peikoff.
Okay.
I was wondering, I'm sure I'm wrong, but you can tell me why I'm wrong, I'm hoping. Why you picked integration to run through, as opposed to, you could have taken several things you mentioned in this lecture, say time and space, and all 5 different views of time and space, or causality and logic, and 5 different views. So, as an example, if you take time and space,
I get it. I don't know. I feel that obviously I did not make my point clear, because your use of concepts to analyze or identify other phenomena depends on your method of thought. And I spent the whole class saying that there's only one method, and that determines all the rest. So it would be irrelevant for me to say, well, time and space are everywhere, and gravity is everywhere, and confusion is everywhere, and therefore, why don't I start with those? I did not pick a topic because it happened to interest me. I picked it because in my study of epistemology, that is the fundamental, and everything else about the content of one's knowledge comes from the method, and that's the method. Is that not an answer?
Yeah, that does.
Okay. Yaron, is that it? Yeah, okay.